Title of this message is A Key to a Richer Relationship with God, Part 1. Come back next week for Part 2, which, well, I think it may surprise us a little bit. And one of the keys is appreciation and thankfulness. And we're going to talk about the life of one man primarily that exemplifies this key. It was King Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of the first empire. By the way, one way to look at those four world empires that are mentioned in Daniel and in ancient history, they provided order that helped do things God wanted done. Just for instance, the Roman Empire. I was reading something, and the guy said the Roman Empire gave the world Christianity. And what he meant by that was, they called it Pax Romana. The ancient world, from I guess the hills of Scotland all the way deep into Eastern Europe and deep into what we would call the border of India and Pakistan, all through northern Africa, the Middle East, all of that, and Spain was all part of the Roman Empire, so that church apostles and other people pushing the gospel could freely go from city to city. Prior to that, there's a bunch of warring little states that fought with each other and all had their own religion. And Rome allowed other religions, and Judaism was accepted, so they thought of it was kind of a branch of Judaism. And I know we hate to say good things about the Roman Empire, but I'm saying this in a relative sense. In a relative sense, they had law and order, they had courts, they had a level of religious freedom. Now later, Nero and Caligula messed it up, but that's a later story. So I'm not saying some bad stuff didn't come out later on. And also when the universal church, Christian church came. But still, the gospel was able to go around the world in places that it would not have been able to do, except for those four world empires kept relative order and peace in the known world at that time. And the first of those was Nebuchadnezzar. And we believe God actually allowed that for his own purposes. He did that. And Nebuchadnezzar actually wrote chapter 4. I believe he's the only pagan who wrote part of the Bible. It's written in Chaldean and not in Hebrew. We assume he didn't even speak Hebrew, but he wrote it in Chaldean, and obviously it was canonized, so God wants us to learn what Nebuchadnezzar had to say. So I'm going to pick it up in Daniel 4, verse 1 to 4. This is obviously it's in English, but originally he wrote it in Chaldean. And this is his personal testimony. So Nebuchadnezzar said, I, Nebuchadnezzar, king unto all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth. Because pretty much most of the civilized world was under his empire. That was not an exaggeration. Peace be multiplied unto you. It has seemed good unto me to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has wrought toward me. Now, when he says the Most High God, we don't believe that he was fully converted or anything. He still thought there were lesser gods, all those different gods, all the different little people had. You could rattle off the different names of different gods. I won't rattle them all off. But he thought there was one God higher than all the others. That was the Hebrew God, or the God of Daniel's people, because he had seen the power, and more would be seen yet to come, of Daniel's God. So he thought of the Most High God as like up there, and all the other gods were there. So he wasn't fully converted, but you can see he's starting to appreciate the real truth, as he said, the Most High God. Verse 3, how great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. God's power will never stop. Nebuchadnezzar, then he tells the story. He was at rest in his house, flourishing in his palace. And then he had this dream that frightened him to his core, really scared him. I'm going to jump to verse 14, but you can read the whole thing when you get a chance. And this dream really scared him. And he cried aloud, and a watcher, we would probably call it an angel, in his dream, came down and said, chop down the tree, cut off its branches, Strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit, and let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. Because basically what the dream said, there's this great tree that could be seen from like all over the world. Because dreams don't have to be logical. And all the animals live under the shelter and fruit of this great tree. And of course, he learned that tree was him, and the Babylonian Empire that he commanded was the great tree. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. That's important, by the way. Let it be wet with the dew from heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Actually, there is a mental disease where people think they're cows. It's fairly rare, but let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let it last 7 times pass over him. In other words, if we know the meaning of the dream, he would soon know that he would no longer have the mind of a man. He'd have the mind of an animal. I guess you'd call it mental illness. We believe that there's a spirit in man which we do have animalistic tendencies too, but we can, they call it self-actualization. They don't believe animals can think about themselves in the abstract like human beings can. They just react. I'm not saying there aren't smart animals like predators, but it's still a reaction kind of thing. And he lost, or God blocked it, turned it off, that part of him that made him human. So now he's just reacting like a hungry animal, eating grass, and hungry animals fighting off predators. Verse 17 and 18. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. In other words, who runs all these great kingdoms? God does. Who allows, we can say, the great 4 empires of the world? God does. And maybe to a lesser extent. And people say, yeah, well, if that's true, why is there evil in the world? Maybe that's a debate for another time, but it's because of Satan. And I think God is teaching mankind hard lessons that will eventually be to our benefit. I look at it this way. If there's all this suffering in the world, there has to be a great reward to justify it, if that makes sense. And mankind is scheduled for a great high reward, and that's why all the suffering. But God does allow it. And he will take care of Satan in the very near future, and some of these things will end. But that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. No one can deny that, right? You think of some of the people that have run some countries, you think, man, couldn't have gotten any worse than the guy they picked. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, was seeing. Now you, Belshazzar, declare its interpretation. I was listening to a story about the French Revolution and King Louis, I might get my title right, the 14th, whichever it was. And the kid was like a spoiled teenage brat who got the throne. Anyway, and that's maybe, and so was his queen. And anyway, people who get great power can really be, bums. They don't know nothing. And they screw things up. Anyway, but that's one example of what I mean by sometimes the lowest of people can inherit power. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen now, you, Belshazzar, declare its interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you're able, for the Spirit of the great holy God is in you. And he was truly frightened, because dreams can convey emotion. Now, why didn't the wise men of Babylon give him the interpretation? It wasn't really that hard to do. Wise men are wise enough not to tell an emperor bad news. Off with his head. The bearer of bad news gets a bad reputation. It's basically saying, God is sick of you because you're too proud and arrogant. None of the wise men of Babylon wanted to tell him that. But Daniel, of course, could and did. So, why is Nebuchadnezzar in trouble with God? because he took all the credit for himself. He didn't appreciate that he was given that role of being one of those four, ruling one of the four great empires for peace, because God had his reasons. And by the way, just one thing you might, it's not a small thing, but all the temple paraphernalia Nebuchadnezzar put in the treasury of his government. And later, when the Persians, right after him, gave permission to rebuild the temple, all those things were given back to the Jews and put in the temple, and the temple in which Jesus Christ preached in, which makes it more important than we might think. You know, what's the importance of the second temple? Christ preached in that temple. Of course, so did Peter and John and other apostles as well. So it's more important than it might seem. But he took all the credit. He did not appreciate what he'd been given by God. And what I want to say is, one of the keys to having a better relationship with God is to appreciate what God has given. And hopefully we'll expand on this more in part 2. And I think it's not just a question of knowing it mentally. And I mean, that's part of it. We want to understand it deeper and deeper and deeper and higher and higher. Really understand and appreciate what God has given us. And it's like a spiritual shield of protection. The more you appreciate and are thankful what God has given to you, I think the closer you are to God and the safer you are spiritually, because it like attracts God and God's protection to you. The more unappreciative you are, and you say, I did it all myself, God doesn't like that. You know, Christ said in Matthew 5 that the humble and meek will inherit the world. I think one reason for all the bad things and thunderstorms and volcanoes and maybe tornadoes is to teach people a little humility. We're not so high and mighty, and God wants us to be humble in the right way, of course. In other words, appreciating God helps us get closer to God. Getting back to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 4, verse 26. Inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that the heaven rules. In other words, Daniel's saying, after you come to your senses, you're going to rule, because that iron band is God's way of saying that your kingdom will be protected. Now, if you think about this logically, anyone who's in a power position like Nebuchadnezzar would have a lot of enemies, just natural rivalry. The more you succeed in politics, in power politics, the more your rivals will hate you. It's just one of those principles. If you fail, well, they probably laugh at your failure, but they'll be less out to get you. Do you understand how that works? I think that affects our own president a little bit too. But regardless, can you imagine if you went insane for 7 years and none of your opponents exploited that? Or they didn't send some guys with arrows to kill you while you're out in the field running around like an animal? None of that happened. None of the conspirators got control of the government. That in itself is a miracle. It shows you God was in control. He wasn't removing him. He was teaching him a tough lesson. That's what Daniel's telling him at this point. Verse 27. Therefore, O king, this is Daniel talking to Nebuchadnezzar, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be lengthening of your prosperity. In other words, Daniel says, just because you got this prophecy, prophecies can fail. Remember Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13, prophecies can fail, like with Nineveh. In other words, Daniel is saying, show God some appreciation and obedience, and God could cancel this. And by doing real things like being nicer to the poor and being, I don't know what his unrighteous acts were, but if you're an emperor with total power, can you imagine all the mischief he could have gotten into? Though we're not giving any details, but I think I've read a few stories that some of those emperors did. But whatever it is, he's saying, show your appreciation for God by the way you live and the way you do things. And if God sees this improved attitude, he may call this prophecy off. Now, we all know what happened, of course. It didn't happen. In verse 30, we're going to pick up what Nebuchadnezzar actually did. Daniel 4, verse 30. The king spoke, saying, "Is not this the great Babylon that I built?" Notice the I, not God gave me, or in cooperation with God, I was blessed to have this opportunity, "that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power for the honor of my majesty." You know, I was thinking about the two greatest presidents of America that may have saved this country, Washington and Lincoln. You could probably say that God actually worked things out so that those men got in a position of power and survived it. I mean, there's plenty to, especially in the case of Washington, where, you know, during the French and Indian War, he had all kind of bullet holes in his hat and his clothes, had 2 horses shot off from under him, and yet he survived. The American Revolution, he was riding on a white horse with his epaulets, you know, showing you the commanding general, out there right behind the lines, and somehow he never got killed. I'm not saying there were bullet holes in his hat and stuff. And there are other things, too. There are political plots against him. I mean, George Washington, he survived them all. You almost have to know God was with him. There's actually an Indian chief toward the end of the French and Indian War that had this, he says, "You're going to be a great leader," told Washington, I think he was a lieutenant colonel, "and you're going to be a great leader of a great nation, and they won't be able to kill you." The only reason I'm saying that is because it came true, so it makes you wonder. And there are things about Lincoln, how the way the opposition party divided, so that his election was almost a sure bet if the Republicans stayed united, which they did. And I think even Lincoln's background, even though he came from great poverty, it just the way it worked itself out, it's almost like God put him in the position to do what he did to save the Union, as well as end slavery. A lesser man, well, I'm going to all things, good things about that, but a lesser man, this country could have easily fell apart. By the way, many people in Europe and Britain said that the way America is set up, there's no way that country can survive. It's going to divide and split and split and split, and it probably would have. The point I'm getting at is God puts people in high positions, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't appreciate that he was blessed to be there. You could probably say the same about Alexander the Great. His dad prepared everything for him. A lot of people have breaks to get them where they were. They just don't appreciate them. You know. And anyway, but he said, I want to emphasize that word here, that I have built for a royal dwelling for my, emphasize that, my mighty power, for the honor of my majesty. While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. God saw that arrogant attitude and said, and yanked his human, whatever it is, away from him. He became like an animal. And the kingdom will depart from you. And it departed for 7 years. He lost the ability to govern the empire. Now, going on to verse 37, Nebuchadnezzar now kind of realizes it toward the end of the chapter what all happened. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. He realizes the credit belongs to God and not him. He's learned a bit of humility. You wonder about Nebuchadnezzar and maybe some other people in the Bible, like Jonathan, that maybe they'll have higher positions than a lot of other worldly people because of things they did and said. But whether that does happen or not doesn't matter. It's up to God. But it's like Nebuchadnezzar came close to conversion. I extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride, he's able to put down. If you walk in pride, you can be put down. And he ended up praising and thanking God when he got his sanity back. And I'm assuming that he could remember what it was like to be an animal. And actually, if you ever get to read the Bible story that is the church put out years ago, there's a drawing by Basil Wolverton of Nebuchadnezzar with hair matted and stringing down, long toenails and fingernails, in rags, a little club in his hand, crawling on the ground like an animal eating grass. It's like, that's what he was like for 7 years. Probably fighting with possums and other animals for food and scraps and that. And I bet his mind remembered what it was like to be an animal when he got his consciousness back. It was kind of, it taught him a lesson. Now this is a corny story called Chardonnay. It's a pinkish orange French wine. Okay, kindergarten teacher student surprised her on her birthday and said, "We've got some gifts for you." So the teacher was happy about it. The first little boy gave her a box, and he said, "Guess what's inside?" Well, knowing that her father was a baker, he said, "I bet you've got me some treats from the bakery." Opened up, sure enough, there was some treats from the bakery. The next student gave her a long box. He said, "Guess what's inside?" Knowing that the child's mother worked in a nursery where they make, plants and flowers, "I'll bet there's some flowers in there." Sure enough, there was a little stem of flowers. The third little boy gave her a box, and it was wet on the bottom corner. Knowing that the boy's dad owned a pet shop, owned a winery, she rubbed her hand against the orange, tasted it, and said, "I think it's Chardonnay, but it has a very, very strange taste. Must be some very rare, very, very rare foreign wine." Opened the box. It was a puppy. A puppy. It was not Chardonnay she tasted. I threw that corny joke in there to try to make a point. We people think we know, right? Everybody, you can read all these political experts, philosophical experts about how man should be governed, what people should do, and they think they know. By the way, if you ever read Karl Marx's Engels' book Das Kapital on communism, and actually they call it scientific. They said they set this in writing. Obviously, it isn't true, but that the workers could scientifically, in the most advanced nations like Britain and Germany, would unionize, take over, and form the workers' socialist paradise. And actually, it would eventually be such a paradise that you wouldn't even need government. Everybody would share equally. It would just be paradise. And they had all kinds of predictions. By the way, it was scientific, couldn't possibly not happen. You all know that never happened. Communism did not come to the most advanced nation, it came to the most backward nation in Europe, power structure, Russia, and it was an absolute disaster. But you're going to say, what does all this have to do with the Bible appreciation? I want to just read this one scripture, and then I'm going to elaborate a little bit of what I mean. Now, this is Paul, Romans 1:21. Paul is talking about why mankind is going in the wrong direction. You can read the whole context. Paul elaborates further, but Romans 1:21, Paul writes, "Because although they knew God," he's speaking of the mankind in the past in general, although they knew God, because in the past, the knowledge of God was available through Noah and his kids, "they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful." I'm emphasizing the words, "nor were they thankful," for what God had given them and the blessings God had given them, but became futile. That means running around in circles doing stupid stuff that doesn't work. Became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. I would say if you look at the philosophical, religious, political leadership of the world in general, you have to say their hearts were darkened. Now, here's one of the things that's most amazing. When you study modernity and the modern world, the 20th century is marked by two things. And the combination of these two things really shows you how darkened the human heart is. One is utopian philosophies and terror and mass murder. And the two go together. When you first think about it, I got this from one of a professor's lectures, but the facts add up. When you think about it, it doesn't seem to make any sense, but it does when you understand it deeply. And we'll go back to all the details, but basically, the philosophers of the Enlightened Age and into the 20th century, they believe that mankind, through big governments and socialism and communism is total socialism, they could create the workers' paradise. And they elaborate on how wonderful it would be, the workers' paradise. But as they started to do all that, one thing became clear. Everybody's not going to go along with the program that you want to create the workers' paradise, so force will be required. And they quickly thought about that and realized it. That's a negative thing, force. Force will be required. And as and this particular scholar had the number at 160 million people killed in the 20th century. 160 million, at least in part, mostly to create this workers' paradise. We all know how evil the communist empire, but also the Nazis were socialists too. Most people don't know that. Nazi stands for National Socialist Party. They were socialists, and even though they and the communists hated each other, they both used the same methods. That is, terror and mass murder to create it. And one of the things they did was, they didn't just go after their opponents, which maybe a freedom fighter would or something. They went after the innocent public. And you're going to say, why the innocent public? I think I understand it. Let's say if, Hitler did this. After they got things going, they sent spies in the German beer halls to listen and see if anybody was complaining about the things the Nazis were doing. And if they focused on somebody complaining about it verbally, in the middle of the night, the Gestapo would come to that guy's house. 500,000 Germans died in concentration camps too. You ended up in one of their concentration camps. By the way, concentration camps and gulags are one of the inventions of the 20th century. And they were not like what they were read about them. These are really horrible places. And after a while, if you were a German citizen, just a regular guy, you'd be afraid to say anything that didn't, no matter what they did, because and they didn't just go after you; they went after your families. It's so bad in North Korea. North Korea is now maybe the worst example still in existence. They will go after your entire extended family and throw them in the gulags. So you're afraid to say anything. Now, I could elaborate, but you get the general idea. The Soviet Union, they had both Lenin and Stalin had various secret police, and they did terrible things. And you soon learn, if you're in those countries, you speak out of turn. Actually, Saddam Hussein, who admired Hitler, borrowed a little of that himself. It's funny the way he did it, but also Stalin did this too. They had a meeting of the, what we call the Politburo, the legislature. And if you stop clapping too soon, they're not making this up. So they would clap, because nobody wanted to be seen. That's how ridiculous it got. You talk about power politics. And they killed and starved out millions of people to enforce it. And to make it worse, it didn't work. As we all know, you can't redistribute what hasn't been done, because it actually, once you take the profit motive out, you don't produce as much. And the more it failed, the more force they had to use to stay in power. Now, eventually, it did collapse, and Ronald Reagan and the Pope and all those were, eventually the Russian people and people in Eastern Europe said, no more. By the way, the Iron Curtain was not put up, as some people thought, because the Russians and the Soviet Union feared that America was going to invade Russia. What would America want to invade Russia for? All that poverty we want to take, It was to keep their own people in a terror state. Because they'd get out of there. The Berlin Wall, nobody would stay in a place like that when they knew, if I get out of here, I can have freedom and prosperity and all. That's how bad it was. But I'm going to make a prediction of the future. It may be more clever this time. When the final Holy Roman Empire comes one final time, Now, maybe it will be more prosperous. They will maybe correct some of the mistakes of the past. But I still believe some of the bully terror tactics will be in place. You will worship the beast and go along with what he wants, or else they'll cut off your credit cards, and they will have, actually, when you read it carefully, there's some slavery mentioned in Revelation, in various, Hitler and the Russians, even though they were opposite type of socialists, they both had work camps. Where they, matter of fact, Natalie and I were in Austria with a bunch of college students. This is, I think it was 92 or 94, visiting one of the big German factories. And this lady from Eastern Europe, I guess she's about 50 or 60, ran in among the students, and she denounced the Germans because she said they locked us up in labor camps, back in the 40s, and treated that particular company. And of course, they had security rush her out of there, but she just wanted to embarrass them in front of these American and British students. It really did happen. I mean, the point and one more thing that I want to say, once you decide you have to use force to create this socialist paradise, it used to be in the past centuries, everything was religious oriented. But now we're in a secular age where it's not religion or God per se. It's the environment, it's socialism, it's the utopia that we're going to create. And therefore, any force we have to use to crush our opponents is appropriate. And a lot of this they got from Saul Alinsky. As I understand it, he was a professor at the University of Chicago, but he studied the mob. Al Capone and I guess the New York mob came from. And he studied mob tactics of enforcement and said we can apply that to socialist government. And apparently, and I got his book at home, so I know for a fact. And in the preface to the book, he dedicates it to the first revolutionary, Lucifer. I can't believe it. A professor at the University of Chicago dedicates a book to the devil, but I got a copy of it. It's in there. It's for real. I'm thinking, man. But obviously those tactics were picked up by many socialist governments. And the point I want to make is that mankind on his own, when Paul says their foolish hearts were darkened, it's true. Men on their own just cannot do it right. Right now, they're into extreme environmentalism. They believe that mankind can control the weather. No, we can't. I know they're going to probably tell you all this snow is because of global warming. And they'll be telling you that in a week or two. And I'm not saying that people can't mess up their local environment and all that. By the way, do you know which country has the cleanest air and water of any major industrial nation? America. And we didn't sign the Kyoto Treaty or the Paris Treaty. A lot of that stuff is all politics. It's really about income redistribution. They want American money to finance what they're doing. But the world's into secularism. They deny God's power. They may have religion, but not real Bible power behind it. And all this evil exists in the 20th century. And man without God goes astray. I want to read one major scripture that talks about the end. Now, we may not have gotten to this point yet, but I can see we're headed this way. And I want to read just two verses, 2 Timothy 3, but the other verses elaborate further. 2 Timothy 3, 1 and 2. But I know this, that in the last days, perilous, or I think the King James says dangerous, I'm using the New King James, perilous or dangerous times will come. Why are things going to be so dangerous in the future? For men will be lovers of themselves. I wonder if that's why divorce rate is so high and anyway, a whole bunch of bad things going on in society. Lovers of money, boasters, proud, proud is instead of being humble. Blasphemers, they say weird, horrible stuff. Disobedient to parents, and I think it means adults and adult parents, not little kids. And unthankful, I want to emphasize that word, unthankful. They don't appreciate. Unholy. Unthankfulness is one reason the world is going to increase in evil. We see it all the time now. And I don't know how many times in the last 2 years I've seen stories about parents killing their own kids. There was one on the news the other day. They don't actually have a motive this time. Sometimes it's angry divorce, but I don't really know the motive. I don't know, it's just pure evil and depression. I can think of. And it's happening all the time. Also, teens shooting up their high school, murdering classmates. It's a regular thing. It used to be, it's only in the big cities, but now it's everywhere. You never know when it's going to show up. When I was a kid, and you all are about my age or maybe a little younger, but they even had hunters who had gun racks in the back of their trucks, and in the parking lot there might even be a few rifles parked during hunting season, and no one even thought of shooting up the school. And the gun laws were even easier than they are now. So it's not guns so much as it is the heart of man has become darkened, just like Paul said. And maybe you can blame some of it on all kinds of things, bad family life, video games, evil movies, but it doesn't matter. That's the world we live in. Now I want to tell this one corny little statement. This is from supposedly from a famous politician, whose name I won't mention to stay out of trouble. Supposedly this politician said, under capitalism, man oppresses man, but under socialism, it's the other way around. There's different men oppressing men. But it's still the same old thing. And I want to just say this, we get close to the end, we need to appreciate our religious freedom. A lot of places don't have it. We need to appreciate capitalism. I'm not saying capitalism is perfect, and you do need some social programs, but I saw this thing in the Buffalo Gap newspaper. It showed these people in a big barbed wire sneaking out of some socialist country to get into a capitalist country. They said, how come you never hear of large numbers of people sneaking out of a capitalist country into a socialist country? Believe me, there are millions that have fled Venezuela, but there aren't millions flooding into Venezuela. If they can get out of North Korea, they get out. But there are not people trying to get into North Korea. You get my drift, don't you? And you're going to say, why are all these people coming to America? Well, maybe there's more than one reason, but at least one is capitalism, they know, gives them the best chance of rising from poverty to probably upper middle class. And it really does. I mean, you might complain about your boss and everybody has bad breaks, but capitalism is better than the alternative. It really is. And just feel for the poor people of Venezuela that are starving. And in the past, millions starved in Russia and died. And also we should appreciate being called in the first resurrection. You know, in the book of Revelation it says, blessed are those who are in the first resurrection. I know it's harder on us because the world has everything, and we have in God's church little or nothing. But Paul said in Romans 8, he said, the glory that will be revealed in us when Christ returns is so great, it's not even worthy to be compared with what we have to suffer. And Paul really suffered. So remember, our reward is so great, whatever you're going to have to go through now is more than worth it. Can't even be compared, Paul said. And we want to be thankful to Jesus Christ. And please come next week for part 2, because there's a lot more that we need to say.